Adam, thank you so much for being here. I am so looking forward to racking the brain of a real estate lawyer. 2022 has been a heck of a year with a lot of changes. We've heard a lot of horror stories, but before I get into all my questions, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, what you do, and how long you've been doing it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Nikki. So I've been a real estate lawyer with WSK Law in Cambridge. I've been practicing with WSK Law for 5 years now, but I grew up in Cambridge, so I know the CKW area really well.
Yep.
I went to Western for my undergrad in London. For law school, I went to Western in London. I did my undergrad at Laurier in Waterloo, and I've been here ever since practicing law.
Wow.
Yeah.
Awesome. Things that I really wanted to pick your brain on today, and coming from a mortgage broker, we've seen and heard a lot of horror stories, especially in the earlier parts of this year, about clients not being able to actually close on the homes that they purchase, not being able to fulfill their purchase contracts. And I really want to talk about this with you because I don't think people understand that one sale is connected to numerous others, could be connected to numerous others. So I really want to talk about some of the consequences of that. So my first question to you is, what's the leading cause, based on your knowledge, of clients being unable to fulfill their purchase contracts?
It's a good question. So I'd say easily the leading cause of clients not being able to fulfill the purchase contract comes down to, on the closing date, they don't have the money to pay the seller. Okay, and actually in the past 6 months, we've seen that a lot, and that's because the real estate market's been dropping. House prices are falling. And so what's happening is people enter into an agreement of purchase and sale. So that's that binding purchase contract. If you hear me say APS, I'm referring to the agreement of purchase and sale. Okay.
I say PSA for purchase and sale agreement.
There you go. So people enter into that contract, but a lot of them don't have their mortgage financing set in place yet, right? That's where people will typically hear terms like conditional on financing, right? So people enter into that contract and it'll say the closing date's in 2 months, just as an example. So that means 2 months after they sign the contract, the buyer has to pay the seller whatever the purchase price is, right? So typically in that 2 month span, the buyer is going to be talking to a mortgage agent like yourself, hopefully, or they're going to reach out to a bank or somebody looking for a mortgage. And so since the house prices have been dropping, when the lender does an appraisal of the property, the appraisal comes in lower than expected. The buyer thinks, oh, I'm buying this property for $1 million. The house is worth $1 million. But a month and a half down the road, the house is no longer worth $1 million. So I'm getting calls from clients who are panicking, and it's pretty last minute, and they're not able to get financing anymore. They have to come up, like maybe they put 20% down on a property. Now they have to come up with an extra 10% because the bank looks at that $1 million home and says, we did an appraisal, it's only worth $900,000 now. We can't give you that. Exactly, they have to make up the difference. So obviously, and we'll get into the consequences, of course, of what happens when they don't close it, but it's pretty catastrophic and it's traumatic for the buyers, and it often kind of forces them to get into poor lending arrangements, like something that's not very preferential, high interest rates, just to make up that gap. Yeah.
You touched on, doing an appraisal, and it's so important that you're working with a mortgage broker or a mortgage professional who knows that the market is on a decline. And so actioning an appraisal sooner rather than waiting until that's the last condition to fulfill, that's an important piece of the puzzle too.
It makes a huge difference.
It makes a huge difference. I always say you need to have a team of people on your side, including a lawyer, a mortgage agent, a real estate agent, and you need all of those people to see success in something like this. And we've seen a lot of appraisals come lower than the purchase price, and the client is responsible for making up the difference from the purchase to the appraised value. And I do think we need to take responsibility in knowing that that's a factor, knowing that that's a possibility, and actioning accordingly to prevent that from happening.
For sure. And it's funny, people are only kind of, at least from a client perspective, like mortgage agent, like you've been aware of this kind of risk for years, but people who are just buying a home, they're not aware. And for the longest time, house prices were going up, which meant people never had that risk. Yeah, people would go in for the appraisal at the last minute, and they didn't have to worry because they know the appraisal is going to come in
higher,
even higher.
Right.
That's right. So it's only really been in that past 6 months, maybe a little more, maybe 8 months, that those appraisals have been coming lower. So yeah, people are facing that.
So talk to me about consequences and legal implications to not fulfilling a purchase contract.
Right. So you mentioned right there, a key word is contract. Okay. So that agreement of purchase and sale is a legally binding contract for the buyer and the seller.
Right.
Okay. So that means when they get into that contract, the buyer is legally responsible to pay, whatever the purchase price is on the closing date. If they don't, then they're in breach of contract.
Right.
Okay. So there's a couple kind of directions a transaction can take if it doesn't close on the closing date. Okay. So I guess first off, let's talk about the big one. Okay. So if the seller doesn't want to renegotiate, okay, or extend the closing, the deal is terminated. Okay. So that means the seller gets to just relist the property and sell it to somebody else. Okay. And I mean, it's inconvenient for the seller because they have to go through the whole listing process again. That could take months to get, and they're going to enter into a new contract. Yep. And that contract, typically you're going to have at least a month before it closes, right? So the seller gets into this new contract with somebody else. The buyer's just left hanging. They lost their shot to get that home.
Yep, and their deposit.
Usually their deposit too. Yeah. That's right. Unless there's special wording in the contract, which we can touch on that afterwards.
Sure,
but yeah, so the buyer's already, out to lunch, right? The seller relists the property and eventually they'll sell the property, right? Somebody will come along, they buy the property, but if that property, when they resell it, is sold for a lower price than what was originally agreed upon, that original buyer is on the hook for that whole difference.
Right.
So with house prices going down, if the seller sells the house for $200,000 less 2 months down the road, the seller doesn't care because they're going to sue the buyer for the full $200,000 and they're going to win typically. Right. And it's not just that decrease in price that the buyer is exposed to. The buyer is going to be on the hook for all of the carrying costs of the seller for those 2 months. So if there was a bridge loan or the mortgage, the utilities, that the seller is likely trying to buy their own home too. Right. And so there's going to be costs associated with that purchase as well. Again, that original buyer is on the hook for that. Right. So hundreds of thousands of dollars at least in liability for the buyer if they can't close it. For the seller, they have to deal with the legal consequences of, having to sue them. Right. And that lawsuit can take some time. But I would say it's a relatively low risk lawsuit. I mean, the agreement of purchase and sale is very clear. Pay this money on this date or, you've violated the agreement. So it's not very difficult for the seller to be successful in court. Right. So I guess that's, the worst case scenario for the buyer, but also a very common scenario. Right. The alternative is the buyer and seller renegotiate the closing date. Okay, so the seller, their incentive is they don't want to have to go through that whole relisting process. They don't want to have to go through, the process of suing somebody. Right. So usually people will try to negotiate an extension just long enough for the buyer to make up that difference, make up that price, right? So, and I know, you've probably dealt with buyers who are trying to make up that difference and going through that negotiation process. It's not easy.
It's not.
And
very stressful.
Very stressful. Very, especially for the buyers. They're between a rock and a hard place, right? And usually when the buyer is trying to negotiate the extension, it's costing them something, right? The seller is inconvenienced. And for all the buyer knows, maybe the seller needed to sell their home on that date because they needed that money for their own purchase, right? And it's like that chain reaction you're talking about. Right. So part of the renegotiation, like in my own experience, typically the buyer is going to be paying a few extra thousand at least, could be 5, could be 10,000, could be more, just to compensate the seller so that the seller doesn't terminate the contract. Right. And there's going to be a new deadline on that extension, and there's going to be even more severe consequences if they can't close on that extended date. And releasing the whole deposit is typically one of the first.
Right.
Right.
So best case scenario would be an extension on the purchase and sale agreement
Definitely.
with additional costs to compensate the seller
Probably.
for renegotiating.
Yeah.
There's a potential for loss of deposit, a potential for a lawsuit from both the seller and the other seller of the home that the seller is purchasing.
Right.
Correct?
Yes.
So it could be potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that would be the worst case scenario.
Easy.
So to summarize,
Yeah.
fulfill your purchase contract.
Fulfill your purchase contract.
And ensure
Absolutely.
you're going into a contract that you can close on.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. And
Right.
just to expand on that chain reaction, like consider this, right? If you're buying a home, like most people who are buying a home, they're waiting for their home to sell,
Right.
right? They need that money.
Yeah.
If the person buying their home isn't able to close, then they are going to get that buyer now is going to get sued for the home that they can't close.
Right.
And there's no limit to how big
How
that
many-
chain can be.
Right. The
And
domino effect. would be-
it's the domino effect, and it's really the person at the very end. They get to sue the person before them, who gets to sue the person before them, who gets to sue the person before them. And it's a chain reaction to the very first person who wasn't able to close the deal.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're the ones that caused it, and that's the one that's going to feel it the hardest.
The hardest, but everybody in that whole chain is going to be in
Not
some
going to be
trouble.
happy.
Yeah, that's
right.
right. Yeah.
So I always tell my clients when they're picking a real estate lawyer that it's important to pick the right one. Right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Everyone does things a little bit differently. There's old school, there's new school. You and I both know that.
Right.
And I think that the cost of legal services definitely deters people, and they always go for the cheapest option.
That's right.
So I'd like you to touch on the average cost of working with a lawyer to fulfill a purchase agreement.
For sure.
And what's included in that? The timeline, what's included in the average cost?
For sure. In terms of costs, so I guess big picture, if a client comes to a real estate lawyer and says, I want to buy this property, like help me fulfill the terms of the contract, the lawyer's job is to make sure the buyer gets clear title to the property.
Right.
So title refers to the actual legal ownership right to that land or building, whatever it is. Okay? So as part of the lawyer, like in order for the lawyer to ensure that their client gets clear title, there's due diligence involved.
Absolutely.
Right? And so that's where the fees start to build up. As soon as there's due diligence, the lawyer is going to have to do a title search. Okay? But the costs vary depending on the type of property. So I guess as a starting point, and did you want me to touch on the price for sales as well, or just purchases?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So I'll build up through all of it. Okay. So sales are always the cheapest because the lawyer doesn't have to do that due diligence. They're just looking to sell the property. So for a standard residential sale, you're looking at probably $1,200 to $1,500, and that includes most of the software fees, the legal fees, the time involved, pretty much everything to close that sale.
Right.
Okay. There's not much due diligence that has to happen there. But with a purchase, then you have a title search. Okay. The title search may reveal that there's a lien against the property. Maybe there's encumbrances, right? Yeah. There could be multiple mortgages on a property. There could be old expired security interest. There's all sorts of encumbrances that could be there.
Yeah.
Each one of those encumbrances has to be investigated. Okay. The client's going to need title insurance. Title insurance, the fee depends on how expensive the property is, really, right? If it's a cottage, then we don't even quote on cottages because as soon as you're looking at, some property up north, maybe it's waterfront, there could be, GRCA or environmental issues. Dealing with those kinds of issues, you have no idea when you're walking into it what those kinds of fees will be. So I guess as a starting point for a standard purchase, legal fees you're looking at least probably like $1,500 to $2,000 in that range. But then you have those variables. So title insurance depends on the property. Land transfer tax, that's a big one. Again, depends on the property. So I talk to a lot of clients, they don't know what land transfer tax is, but if you're buying a property in Ontario, you're paying land transfer tax to the government. And it's around 1.5% to 2% of the purchase price. And if you're purchasing in Toronto, double it.
You double it. I was
Double
just about to say. The
Yeah.
location matters as
The
well.
location
Land
matters,
transfer
that's
tax.
right. So, yeah, 1,500 to 2,000, but it can definitely range depending on how complex the property is.
Right.
Condos, you're looking at the lawyer has to review the condo status certificate.
Right.
Right?
That's a big part of purchasing a condo.
It's a big part.
Right.
As part of buying a condo, you're becoming an owner of the condo corporation. You're a partial owner of that whole building,
Yeah.
in a sense, right? And so you're working with the other condo owners to maintain the building, maintain the property. So maybe that condo building has to replace the roof in 2 years or 3 years. That roof replacement could cost a couple $1 million. And who's paying for that replacement?
Right.
All the condo owners.
Right.
So, right. So if you're purchasing a condo, take that 1,500, 2,000, add another few $100. Right. So, clients often call, they're price shopping when they're looking for that purchase. And, you know, I guess there are certain real estate lawyers who will appeal to that. They run their practice in such a way that they are trying to offer legal services at the cheapest rate.
Right.
But that also typically comes with the consequence that that lawyer isn't being paid to do a full title search, to
Right.
ensure that the buyer isn't, you know,
Protected.
suddenly going to be on the hook for some sort of condo roof repair or something like that.
Right.
So definitely, like you mentioned, hiring a professional, experienced real estate lawyer who will actually take the time to protect the buyer, definitely worth it. Definitely
And you
worth
do
it.
get what you pay for.
You do get what you pay
Including
for.
in legal services.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
I have to agree. Do you have any other tips that you can give buyers to prevent them from not being able to fulfill their purchase contract?
For sure. So a common one is stagger your closing dates, right? So most purchasers are relying on the sale of their home, right? So sometimes clients schedule the purchase and the sale in the same date, and that is very risky because the lawyers have no control over when their sale closes.
Right.
It could close at 4:30 p.m. There's not enough time to close their purchase, so they're gonna, you know, they're gonna breach it potentially. So there's also the risk that maybe, like we were talking about, that appraisal comes in too low, and now they're scrambling, the buyer's scrambling to make up that difference, find the money to fulfill the purchase price. So if the buyer, when they're first structuring, you know, when are we closing the purchase and the sale, if they just move the closing date of their purchase to be 1 week before the sale, 2 weeks before the sale, and getting that bridge financing in place, it's a huge protection for them. In particular, because bridge financing is flexible. If they need an extra 2 weeks to pay off the bridge financing, the lender's typically fine with that. Yeah. So having the separate closing dates and, you know, giving yourself a good gap there of at least a week makes a huge difference. Though the buyers who have bridge financing in place almost never breach that purchase.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually agree that bridge financing is a huge tool that can be used.
Mm-hmm.
I often recommend the same thing. Bridge financing, if it's going to be used for a short period of time, is not very costly if used properly.
Right.
But it does add a very big level of protection and helps with sanity a little bit.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
Peace of mind. And yeah, a lot of people, they may be hesitant, but just because they think, oh, an additional cost, like what's the point? But really, if you compare the cost of that bridge financing compared to not closing that purchase, huge difference.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
So we've touched on a lot of things. We've talked about the change in the 2022 market, some of the consequences of being able to not fulfill a purchase and sale agreement. I'd like to know from a legal standpoint, what advice do you have to home buyers right now?
So actually talk to the mortgage agent well ahead of time. Even if they're just thinking about buying a home, talk to the mortgage agent, figure out how big of a mortgage are you, like eligible for, right? I know like you'd be able to give them a good range, like this is based on your assets, this is what you're entitled to. But also they want to talk to an experienced mortgage agent who can explain these risks that, if the house appraisal comes in a little lower, well, based on your assets, maybe you should be looking for a home with a lower purchase price, right? Because as we discussed, the consequences for not closing a purchase, catastrophic.
Right.
That home buyer is going to be kicked out of the real estate market for years, just making up, you know, all the damages that they're going to owe, right? So having that experienced mortgage agent, and also talking to a realtor ahead of time. So realtors are not all one and the same.
No.
Okay, and as like was previously mentioned, that agreement of purchase and sale, it's a legally binding contract, and 99% of the time it's the realtor who's preparing that contract. Right? They're the ones putting in the clauses to protect the buyer and the seller. So if you don't have a realtor who understands, I guess, the legal consequences of the actual language they're putting in there, you're not necessarily being protected by the realtor. Right. So the language in that contract can make or break a transaction, and it can mean the difference between, you know, a buyer getting into a property and learning that, you know, there's some sort of significant damages to the property and actually being compensated for it or not, right? Are they buying the appliances as is, or is the seller making a warranty or representation that all the appliances in the property are in good working order? A little changes in the language in the contract can mean thousands of dollars of difference for that buyer. So having a good mortgage agent to make sure you are able to close your purchase, huge.
Huge.
Having an experienced realtor who knows how to structure the contract to protect the buyer and seller, huge.
Huge.
Yeah.
So,
and then having the lawyer to be able to actually do the title search, again, it's an important part.
Yeah, absolutely. So having a team of people
Having
that are going to set yourself up for success, have your best interest at heart, know the risks, explain it to you, inform you along the way, and ultimately set you up for long-term success so you're not facing catastrophic damages.
That's right. That's right.
Absolutely.
Having that team. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. You've given us such valuable information.
Yeah, thanks for
I really
having me.
appreciated you
Absolutely.
being here.
It's great
Thank
meeting you.